But this to me is a classic example of making the perfect the enemy of the good. Is one way to think about this. Euclid's Elements may be the most pure form of geometry we can conceive of. That doesn't mean that's what we need to teach students, particularly younger students, with.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud and we are the core for today, Martin, Tanya, and Paul. Glad to have you back, Martin. You've been gone.
I have been. Yes.
Man of mystery.
And I can tell you that the cruise, I love this show, but the cruise was more enjoyable.
I can't believe that you would say that.
Wow.
Why didn't you take us? We could have taken this on the road.
Because I would have had to
pay for us.
Pay for you. And I could not be alone in my chair on the 14th deck of the Celebrity Reflection, looking over the Caribbean, reading my book.
What book did you read, Martin? Let's just get moving.
Well, I'm working on Portrait of an Artist by...
No, Portrait of a Lady.
Portrait of an Artist.
Not Portrait of an Artist.
Yeah.
Okay. No. Portrait of a Lady. I'm sorry. Henry James.
You've just about been through every Henry James book now.
No, I haven't. I've only read it's my third.
Washington Square. Daisy Miller.
But even Washington Square, you
haven't
read a long time ago.
No.
Washington Square, you read a long time ago, right? Like I read it thinking I was going to talk to you about it, and you were like, "Oh, it's been a long time since I read that."
It's been a while. No, and then I discovered this little book, and I can't even remember the name of the author, but it's about the 7 liberal arts historically, and it is dynamite. I just sat there on the stern of the boat, and next to a little putting green. And I was reading this thing, and it's fabulous. So I will be probably recommending it to everybody after I'm done here.
How'd you find it?
It was, I don't even know. Well, it was in a box when I moved. I think I did order that one recently. I just saw it somewhere online.
Is this the one that you had me, that I went and bought?
No.
After you read, it's a different one.
That's Liberal Education by, who was
Mark
that?
Van Doren.
Mark Van Doren. That is excellent. But that's more philosophical. This is more practical on how the liberal arts were practiced in the early Middle Ages and how they went back and what they took from the ancient writers and then what happened in the school. So it's a historical treatment, but it's really interesting.
Tanya?
Well, I'm reading The Turn of the Screw. We're in the Henry James thing, and I'm listening to it. And I have the book too, so I can go back and look. So far, I haven't found anything I wanted to go back and look at. I'm just not a ghost story person.
Well,
but
can I just say one thing?
Yes.
The way you're reading it.
Yes.
I don't think...
It's Emma Thompson.
Huh?
It's Emma Thompson.
Well, fine. But I think Henry James prose, I discovered this with Portrait of a Lady, that I can't listen to it. I've got to read James. I
don't agree. I listened to Washington Square and it was beautiful.
Yeah, I just am not a fan at this point, but the book that we got has Washington Square and Daisy Miller in it. So I'm going to reread those and see if I like Henry James. See, I don't even remember when I read him the first time, if I even liked him. And I did read Portrait of a Lady too. I read a lot.
You mentioned that you didn't like the copy we have to me the other day. And you're absolutely right. Like it doesn't even open wide enough. Like the margins, the interior margins are not wide enough.
That's right.
Which is why you really, for those kind of books, and I was looking around for one for Portrait of a Lady, you need a hardback because hardbacks will open more widely.
Or just,
and it's
now
classic.
You can get paperbacks that will lay open that are just feel, a book needs to feel good. Maybe that's my problem is the book doesn't feel good.
It needs to feel good and it needs to smell good.
I'm also reading.
Have you noticed this?
Yes, it does need to smell good, but it does help for it to be good. But I do think the actual visceral experience of the book is important. And I will pay a little bit more to get a beautiful book, but depending on what it is. But I'm also reading Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Spy novel.
Yes. And so I'm working my way through Le Carré.
And liking it?
Yes. I just I don't know why I like him.
Yeah.
Because I'm not really a spy novel person, but I do.
So I'm working on Turn of the Screw as well, which I'm enjoying. But I also it was a rare moment where I had like 2 or 3 hours just to sit down and read. And maybe that's why I liked it so much, because I actually got to sit down and read.
I think you like that genre.
But I do like the genre.
Because you liked Rebecca. I didn't like Rebecca.
That Memoria?
Yes.
And I didn't like, I don't like Wuthering Heights. Really? I don't like that genre.
Yeah, I didn't really care for Wuthering Heights, but I definitely did like Rebecca. Rebecca was great.
And you even went and read the other book that she wrote that was the same kind of...
Rachel,
I think.
Yeah, that one was also good. Those were great. But I also, on the drive home yesterday, 12 hours in the car, I decided that I was going to listen to Wallace Stegner, which I have tried before and failed. And so I went and looked for his shortest book, which is actually his first book, Remembering Laughter.
Oh, I haven't even read that.
It was 3 hours. I mean, it's a very good book. Very good book. I mean, but the whole story is a adulterous affair of a man with his wife's sister, but then how they deal with it and raising the child that comes out of that, and it's a messy story.
Yeah,
it's a really messy story. But
and it was his first book.
Yep, very very good writing. Lots to think about.
3 hours. That's more like a novella.
It is. It was. But it got me 3 hours down the road.
So you've tried Angle of Repose?
I think that's the one I tried.
Or Crossing to Safety.
I think it was Angle of Repose that I tried, and
I did Big Rock Candy Mountain, and it was good, but under normal circumstances, it wasn't good enough for me to pursue other stories by that author. But I have been told repeatedly that Angle of Repose is a classic, and so I'm going to read that.
Very good.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to do shorter to see, okay, because I remember I think Shane talked about Angle of Repose, and he said something about he's doing something in there that you can easily miss or hard to see or something along those lines. And I was like, well, let me just see if I can just enjoy a book from him before I go into that.
So now would you read Angle of Repose?
I probably would, but I've realized that I think to really get into him in an audio form, you have to have dedicated time. It can't just be something where you listen to 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there, or even 5 minutes. It's got to be something dedicated to, or you're going to have to pick up the book and read it.
Yeah. I think you could do it though on your daily commute, because you got half an hour in, half an hour out. That's an hour a day.
Could be. Could be. I don't know. But
or you could just read it like, old fashioned, get you a pretty copy.
Well, winter's coming. So
winter's gonna hunker down.
Yeah.
Winter's here, I think.
I've
got my fleece tights on today.
We got a whole month and a half before hunting season's over. I don't get to read till after hunting season.
Oh, excuse me.
We'll check back in with you then.
While you kill Bambi, I will be sitting around reading.
There's no segue after that.
Some of us have to eat, Tanya. You just eat your little rice cakes over there. And
it's fine. It's fine as long as you're going to eat her.
One day we're going to come in here and we're going to say, "Where's Tanya?" And she'll really be here, but she'll have eaten so many rice cakes that there's no substance to them. She'll just nothing.
To nothing.
Yeah. One time Brett Vaden said that how did he put? He said, "Tanya, you eat nothing but things filled with air."
Yes.
And I don't remember what the other thing I was eating besides rice cakes. Saltines, maybe.
Oh.
I do eat normal. I had chicken pizza for lunch. You saw me heat it up.
I saw that you throw the chicken on the table for somebody else to eat.
I forgot to tell Mitchell they were there because he'll eat anything.
Yeah, Kaylee came back in and she was like, "Tanya's chicken wings are still here."
I saw those in the break room.
I forgot to offer them up.
So the theme of our show is dysfunctional office life.
That's so much advice to go around. No, the theme of today's show, we're going to get to a question we've gotten fairly often recently. If Memoria Press is really classical and we want to base our content on ancient works as our foundation, then why are we writing new books? Are we just trying to reinvent the wheel? And one of the questions we've gotten recently, it has to do with our math author, Dr. Sculthorpe. We just had him on the show a few weeks ago, and someone said, well, why are you writing new math books? You could just use Euclid's Elements for geometry. And Dr. Sculthorpe gave a great answer, but we could apply that question to a lot of different subjects. So I want to start with you, Martin. Is there any sort of, in that question, why are you writing new books? Is there any sort of maybe misconception about classical education in that question?
Well, I think that, if you go back and you read a lot of ancient works, we call them great because the ideas are great. And sometimes the writing itself is great. Like with Plato, I think is a great writer. But if you were to get into, some of the other philosophers, for example, in their writings, they're not exactly, they're not written as clearly as they could be. These are ancient works, they're not on a terminal or a laptop writing and then rewriting and then editing. You got a pencil and a pen and paper scarce, and so a lot of these, I think, are first drafts really. And so they're not great necessarily because of the presentation. Right. And something like Euclid is an ancient document. It's based on the ones that we found archaeologically, which many things are written and you don't know if they're like, copies of copies of copies of copy, which they usually are. And you don't even know if you have the original of that. And so they're not great necessarily because of their presentation. It's the ideas that they express. And so I think that gives us some leeway to be able to put them in a better presentation, right? Which is certainly, I think, the case with math.
Yes. So when we first started, and my son, who was in one of, if not the first geometry class, we did use Euclid. Do you remember? It was like Cheryl got it off the internet and it was just comb bound that she just printed in-house, and there was no help at all. And so, we were dependent on a very good teacher in order for the students to even be able to do it. And so that stuff, you've got to provide help.
Yeah, I think you said when you said there was no help, but I believe in that book were diagrams of what was being talked about. And in original Euclid, there are no diagrams.
Oh, right? I don't know.
It's purely just text, right? And so it's even that sort of thing that Euclid, because Euclid is talking about abstract geometrical universals, there are no diagrams in his work. And so if you're going to use real Euclid, then you have to also use no diagrams, right? Like how fundamental are we going to be in this? Right. The sort of a similar question would be, well, then why are you using a translation instead of reading the thing in the original Latin or Greek? Well, and that brings me to, I just remember when you were reading that question, what was coming to my mind was Cheryl Lowe's thing about classical education for the 21st century. And I remember turning to her after reading a program of studies from the 1500s, and I said, hey, why don't we do what they did, which was like 6 hours or 9 hours of Latin a day from 3rd grade to 6th grade, and then we could do 7th grade and up in pure Latin. And she said, Paul, you convince the parents and we'll do it. And that was just sort of her way of saying, like today, we don't grow up with the expectation of that our children are going to be familiar enough with Latin or in Greek to be able to study Euclid in Greek or study Plato in Greek, right? Like there has to be some distilling that's happening.
And I think that is a really important point. And I think that's key to what we're talking about, is that we're not now where people used to be in education. We don't have it used to be that people in just regular schoolrooms, teachers that weren't necessarily anything special, but they had all had that classical education and they were capable then of passing it on. And we don't have that. We're in a whole different place.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing is that we have no indication that a lot of these books were written for classroom use.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There's almost an entire context in each work that we're missing.
Yeah. Right. They're not, so they read differently. I mean, it reads differently if you're doing something for a class or if you're doing something maybe for teachers. Maybe the book was for a teacher to take and use his good judgment in class and in terms of how to present it. But this to me is a classic example of making the perfect the enemy of the good is one way to think about this. I mean, Euclid's Elements may be the most pure form of geometry we can conceive of. That doesn't mean that's what we need to teach students, particularly younger students with.
Mm-hmm. Now, Euclid did not write that for high schoolers.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and that's a huge part. Like when Martin says that these weren't written for the students. I mean, most everything we have that's ancient is geared towards an adult.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Or students of a different generation. Back when, I don't know how far back, say when Harvard was founded, it was a different education. Mm-hmm. And everybody coming up had it. Mm-hmm. And
if you're going to be admitted to Harvard, the requirement was you knew Latin and Greek and had read quite a number of the great books already before you got there.
Right. So like it was just part of the accepted education, and that's gone. And so what we're trying to do is bring it back, but we're bringing it back with teachers who don't have a classical education, who would not have been accepted to Harvard, and with students who haven't been brought up. But even, I mean, not just Euclid and high school works that should be adult works, which is what we're doing. Cheryl got these old math books, those Iroquois math books. And she showed me, she was so fascinated with them for a bit. And she showed me like the first grade book, and they had to do these drills in 15 minutes. And so she would go to her desk and try and time herself and try to do these drills. And she would come back and say, I can't do what a first grader could do in the 30s. I cannot get it. I can't do it in 15 minutes. And it was just a standard then. That's where, that's how far we've come. Away from what used to be, from what I guess we would say was the ideal.
Yeah, this is sort of a Gnostic temptation, a top-down type of thing, right? We think that we can take these things that basically were for adults and that we can teach these directly to children in the same kind of formula. It's not true. We do this with Socratic Method. And I mean, Socrates said it was only appropriate to men over the age of 30. And here we are trying, some classical educators I hear trying to teach this at the, middle school, high school level.
So then
we have to think about age appropriateness, and it's not something the great writers were necessarily thinking of.
So I'd be curious to know then from you, Martin and Paul, because you've both written guides for us. Martin, you have done a lot in logic and rhetoric, and Paul, you with metaphysics, but you didn't just stick with Boethius. You didn't just stick with Aristotle. What guided you then in how you created?
Okay. Well, that's a very good question, because when I was going and looking for logic texts to use, it's like, you really think I should use Aristotle's Prior Analytics as the textbook for this? Because that's the basis of it. No student would be able to do anything. Okay, it's just way too hard. And so what you had is you had the medievals who were like intellectual nannies. They cleaned everything up. They made it teachable. This is what the Middle Ages.
Intellectual nannies?
What's that?
I love that.
We're going to have to save that the medievals were the intellectual nannies.
They were. And they tidied up education and the way it was presented. They were about instruction. So there's a lot of medieval stuff that you can at least more closely base your teaching on. But what happened is the medievals kind of cleaned it up, but it's still, and then I based my books on these texts that were written in the early 20th century, usually by Catholic authors who knew Aristotle really well. They weren't trying to do this modern logic, which is really mathematics. And their texts were the clearest. Their texts were the most teachable. So I took the most teachable texts from the early 20th century and made them, I think, even more teachable, even more logical, even more straightforward. So I think this is just a project that we're always going to be involved in, is trying to make, hard things more teachable.
But what you were teaching is the concept straight out of Aristotle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there's no, even in those concepts, I mean, there's the only sort of addition to it is the mnemonic devices coming out of the Middle Ages on how to memorize what the valid forms of a syllogism are, right? Mm-hmm. Everything else out of that is pure Aristotle. Mm-hmm. Now, my situation is very different because the students really are just reading those original sources, right? Mm-hmm. They're reading Plato directly, they're reading Aristotle directly, Boethius directly, but then it's hard for a student and a teacher to know what to pull out, right? Like, what's the thread that all of these books have in common when you decided to pull those 5 books for a philosophy course, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of thing that in those study guides we're trying to make very clear, because when you're reading any sort of text, you could get fascinated by the smallest little side point, and maybe that'd be a nice little discussion, but you have to have something that's guiding them along and saying, okay, these are the things that you need to be able to hold on to, because that's going to come again later in the course. And so I was not attempting at all to sort of repackage or restate what Boethius and Cicero and Aristotle and Aquinas were saying. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to help give whatever sort of guiding and resources necessary to make that stuff comprehensible and help you focus on here's the core things you need to take with you.
And I think that's a helpful way to describe it, because you aren't filling in the gaps, but you're a guide along the way, pointing out what's important.
Occasionally there's a gap, because if we've skipped 400 years of philosophical thinking from one person to the other, you go, there's some other stuff that happens here, and here's a little bit you need to know in order to make that jump. But by and large, what we're trying to do is make that old stuff accessible.
And I think we're trying to make it accessible to a larger audience now. We're trying to, because our educational system is so messed up, we're really trying to help everybody make it accessible to everybody, regardless of your education, that you can give your children a good education. And so in order to, that was really important to Cheryl, is that what we're doing is accessible to everybody, that everybody can teach Latin, that everybody can work their way through famous men to Homer and Virgil and Dante. So it was a top-down approach. How do we get there? This is what we want our students to do. How do we get there? And you can do it with, you don't have to use the books that we've chosen. You can, but those are the books that she chose, and it is the path that she chose. And I think it's pretty unique. But part of it too, especially when we talk about the STEM fields, is we can't just do Euclid, because we've got to prepare our students for college geometry and tests to get into college. So we can't stay. Are we compromising because we can't stay there with the old stuff? We have to make it more relevant to what they need in order to succeed in college. Is that a compromise?
Well, but there's also been like intellectual advancements in that time. So like, are we compromising by teaching them, more things that humanity has discovered and figured out, and shorter ways to do things? In geometry, I'm thinking, just all the calculations of angles. Euclid doesn't calculate an angle, but the Cartesian geometry that we bring in, that's a very, very useful tool. Are we going to just say, no, we don't want our students to learn that because it wasn't taught 2,500 years ago?
No, that would be a mistake. That would be very narrow.
So it seems like there are a lot of priorities in the mix when you decide what you incorporate with these guides and what you don't. And some of that is, you're right, our context of our day.
Right. And when we take an old book like the Gerber 13 Colonies in the American Republic, which was 2 books, and we brought it into one. When we went through it at first, there were like 12 chapters on the Spanish-American War. Well, since that book was published, there have been 2 world wars, and the Spanish-American War does not really deserve 100 pages of text. But when he wrote it, it was very recent. It was a big deal. So some of that too changes with time. And so you have to think, what is the best use of students' times? 100 pages on the Spanish-American War, or a little time on the 2 world wars that followed. So, so you do have to do some contemporary things, even with younger students, just to keep them.
I mean, every subject has much more in it than it is possible to teach. So, and some of the books are written for a class that's devoted just to that thing, and they really were geared towards teaching the whole thing. Well, we don't have the space in the curriculum to do that. So we have to make judgments, practical judgments about what are the essential things that you need to know in a modern context.
To be well educated.
To be well educated.
Well, and if we're comparing educations from, say, ancient Roman times to ours, when ancient Rome, they don't need to teach you who Jupiter is or who Juno is, right?
Right.
And so what that means is the content load gets heavier and heavier. I would hate to be having to be educated in 1,000 years. I mean, who knows what you'd have to add on, right? But that's where what we're trying to do is keep the old, be as efficient as possible with that, and include what is essential from the new.
Yeah. Outside of math, I know we've talked a lot about math. Is there anything else we're working on with maybe an old source and bringing a new guide to it? Any new works?
I'm not allowed to say because they just praised me in editing yesterday because I no longer make huge promises of things that aren't ready yet. So I can't publicly say, but yes, we are working on them, thinking about Doug's. We are working on things that would bring in old. Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
I just can't say what they are. I'll be no longer praised. But
but also, I mean, just as a stance, as a publishing company, we're not gonna say let's say we want to, I don't know, write something on. I'm just throwing out here physics, right? We're not just gonna go and say what does this modern textbook do over here? Let's do it,
right?
But we're going to go back and we're going to look, okay, like with our principles, with, what were they studying with regards to motion back then, back in ancient times? What were they studying with regards to motion in the medieval times? What are they doing in the Renaissance? What are they doing in the modern period? And make a wholly informed decision, and I mean, that's also going to, our decisions in literature, our decisions in history, any of that, it's all going to be informed.
Well, don't you think, because I've always thought the strength of Memoria is making difficult things teachable.
I thought you were going to say me. Okay.
No,
making difficult things teachable.
But and this is, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. One of the differences and one of the reasons we don't use some of the older stuff is just the practical issue. I mean, is this thing written to be teachable? Well, it's usually not. And it's because there's this distinction in education between the order of learning and the order of knowledge. The order of knowledge is the highest thing is the most important thing. And the order of learning is the priorities on where do you start? Where is it teachable? Which is usually at the opposite end of the spectrum. And so a lot of these ancient works are written from the order of knowledge. That's what I meant by top down. Whereas what we have tried to do, I think over the course of however many years, 20, 25 years, is to precisely that, is to take these things that are in a very difficult form sometimes, or in the wrong, or in an order that makes it hard for a beginning student or whatever. And we have improved them for pedagogical purposes. We've made hard things teachable. I think that's one of the hallmarks of what Memoria has done.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate even hearing like how we get there, with your process and Paul's. And I know, Tanya, you do a lot of that too with literature, probably especially. And I know with math, you've had your hand
math. My favorite subject. Well, I have been more heavily involved in math than I would ever want to be. And if somebody would like to take that off my plate, I would gladly give it away.
Don't look at me.
But I did want to point out that I think when it comes to sort of the development of things, we're doing everything we can to also help the student go from learning just what it says to also now as you're growing older, let's start to evaluate that a little bit. Let's discuss it. Let's see, are there different ways to see things? I mean, this is the whole process of the liberating arts, right? Mm-hmm. Is we don't want to just teach them what that thinker said.
Right.
We're going to initially everything we're teaching them is what is the truth, right? Mm-hmm. And so we've done some distilling for them, but then as you get older and you start encountering the grays of life, and you start to realize that science is theories and not necessarily everything. We present things as things we know when we don't actually know them. It's our way of trying to understand the world, and all of those sorts of things that as the student gets older, we are going to keep introducing them to more and more primary things because we're giving them the tools to actually be able to analyze those things.
Mm-hmm. Primary sources.
Yes.
When you say primary things,
primary sources. Yeah, to be able to read what I don't know why he's the only one coming to mind. No, I'm not going to use him. To actually read what, say, Einstein says, right? Or Heisenberg, to read the letters that these scientists are sending back and forth to each other and see what they're struggling with is something valuable, but that's also not something an eighth grader you can do. An eighth grader needs to understand what force is and what momentum is.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing I think in our approach to these things is we're not even necessarily teaching the great books. But what we are doing is preparing students to read the great books. That's why a lot of what we do is not directly dealing with a particular work. But like somebody said, you couldn't go to Harvard in the 17th, 18th centuries unless you were fully prepared. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of our curriculum is just preparation.
Mm-hmm. I think that's helpful. It's a helpful way to see why we create the guides that we do. Yeah. Well, thanks, Martin, for putting a bow on it.
Thank you, Martin.
We did get that recorded.
Sounds like it's going to be his last. No, we're kidding.
Well, I keep, people are being so nice to me lately. I'm thinking, are they like preparing a retirement party for me, or
you came back from that cruise? How did that happen?
We'll never see him again.
Go off into the sunset, Martin.
I could have stayed. If I had been thinking in my mind, palm trees, ocean, spray, and then on this side, and then Tanya on the other.
And here you are. What a good choice you made.
Favorite place. Oh, well, thank you for joining us. We will be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical, Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical, Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.